Morning, good afternoon, good evening. This cartoon says it all. A picture sometimes can say a thousand words. I think for those who have been following the events in South Africa, you cannot deny that the ANC government these last 30 years has been a great disappointment. ANC South Africa, many people had hoped that it was going to avoid some of the blatant mistakes that some of the other African countries have made, notably Zimbabwe, becoming a dictatorship, corrupt, incompetent, and so forth. One thing that has got to be said about South Africa is that it inherited a democratic system. Nelson Mandela's greatest legacy to that country is that he left the country with healthy and functioning democratic institutions. And the corruption and mismanagement should have been managed under those conditions. Whoever produced this, I think he has captured the very essence of what has gone wrong in South Africa. I'll just read the caption there. A very sad and scary illustration of the last 30 years of ANC rule. Years from now, the ANC will not be remembered as a source of hope and change, but rather as a corrupt government that almost destroyed the nation. All the good the former ANC did will be overshadowed by the greed and corruption that overtook them. I pray that God have mercy on our nation and give us the wisdom and power to move past this leadership and appoint leaders that truly represent the will of the people and rebuild and make South Africa great. I think that it says it all. There's no doubt that there's been corruption in the ANC government, particularly since the exit of the great leader Nelson Mandela. There's been one corrupt regime administration after another. If it's not corrupt, it's incompetent. I, as a Zimbabwean, the one thing that I have said and will say it again is how the ANC government has propped up the Zanu PF dictatorship for its own selfish ends. ANC has been fearful that any democratic change in Zimbabwe would somehow inspire the people of South Africa to seek the same change too. And so they deliberately propped up the Zanu PF dictatorship. But the saving grace for South Africa is that the country has held free, fair, and credible elections ever since 1994. So as much as the last 30 years has seen a corrupt, incompetent, and tyrannical ANC regime, the people of South Africa cannot deny that they had the opportunity to remove that regime and they failed to do so. It's entirely their fault. Unlike Zimbabwe, In Zimbabwe, Zanu PF has rigged elections ever since the country's first elections in 1980. And so we cannot say it was the democratic will of the people of Zimbabwe. Zanu PF has rigged the elections. And that blame has got to be placed on Zanu PF leaders for their greed and their tyrannical rule. Nonetheless, we also cannot deny that in the 44 years since our independence in 1980, the country has had many golden opportunities to end the Zanu PF dictatorship. And one of the best opportunities for that was during the 2008 to 2013 GNU. MDC leaders had the golden opportunity to implement reforms. And full credit to the likes of Minister Lindiwe Zulu of South Africa. SADC, represented by South Africa, was the guarantor of the global political agreement of 2008. And per se, they had a say during the GNU. And full credit to her, she did push the MDC leaders to implement the reforms. But unfortunately, they didn't pay any heed. And indeed, her efforts was noticed by Robert Mugabe, and he was infuriated by it, and it ended up calling her the street woman. We cannot deny that Zimbabwe had the opportunity to end the Zanu PF dictatorship, but MDC leaders sold out. Ever since the 2008 to 2013 GNU debacle, MDC leaders have participated in flawed elections out of greed. And they've enticed the ordinary Zimbabweans to participate in these flawed elections for the same reason: greed. The ordinary people have gained absolutely nothing out of it, out of participating in these flawed elections, except to perpetuate the dictatorship and their own suffering. But this is where we come to what I'll call the failure of the people themselves. George Orwell in Animal Farm said revolutions fail because the people themselves fail to realize when the leaders have served their purpose. And I think he was absolutely right in the case of Zimbabwe. In the book Animal Farm, one of the turning points, at least in that book, why that Animal Farm revolution failed was when the pigs decided apples and milk to themselves. And to persuade the other animals to accept this, the pigs sent Squealer, the pig. And his oratory fooled the rest of the other animals to accept. His argument was the pigs didn't actually like apples and milk. Some of them actually dislike them, but they have got to eat them because it has been scientifically proven that they contain substances useful for the pig's development. And the pigs were the brain of the farm. And his remark, if you want, the last thing he said to convince even those who still were still doubtful, was that he would argue that surely if the pigs were to fail, Jones will be back. Surely, comrades, you do not want Jones to come back. And that usually got all convinced they didn't want the humans back. It's interesting how that has been translated into our own lives in Zimbabwe. Ever since Zanu PF got into power, particularly towards elections, the party has sought to label the opposition as puppets of the West. And Zanu PF is fighting to keep the Western colonizers out of the country. The people have been told that in every bush is a white man, a white colonizer, ready to come back to Zimbabwe. And that's why Zanu PF has got to be vigilant. And after labeling the opposition as puppets of the West, the regime was justified to do whatever is necessary to keep the Western colonizers out of the country and to ill-treat their puppets seeking regime change. And those ordinary Zimbabweans foolish enough to be persuaded by the the puppets, well, they got what they deserved. And so Zimbabweans have been denied their right to a meaningful say in the governance of the country, under the disguise of Zanu PF keeping away the white colonialists. Just as much as Squealer persuaded the rest of the animals in Animal Farm that they've got to let the pigs have the apples and milk, because without that, the humans will come back. Of course, it was nonsense. But that has been adopted by Chamisa himself. Chamisa has been asking Zimbabweans to participate in flawed elections, even when it was clear these elections are flawed. And even when they themselves, the opposition, knew that participating was foolish, and that participating will only give Zanu PF legitimacy. Still, they talk the people into participating. And Chamisa's persuasive final say would be hashtag God is in it. And that seemed to sway millions into believing it. The irony is he has been saying God is in it in many of his promises, particularly promises that the opposition was going to win big. God is in it. And yet, again and again, Zanu PF has blatantly rigged the elections, and the opposition never won them. And the people themselves never asked. So, what did you mean God was in it when he wasn't? It is tragic that people have been so ignorant, naive, and gullible to the point of being exploited, just as the animals were exploited by the pigs. I think as a nation, human beings are supposed to be creatures of reason. The failure by the Zimbabwe populace to see through some of these cheap gimmicks by the politicians is unforgivable. There is absolutely no excuse why so many Zimbabweans have been so gullible to the point of being absurd. Zimbabwe is a failed state because we have failed to hold free, fair, and credible elections. Mugabe and his colleagues have all but captured all the state institutions, the judiciary, the police, the army, you name it. And they've also captured the opposition. As much as we want to believe that Zimbabwe is a democracy, it is not. The MDC opposition we see has proven beyond all reasonable doubt, as far back as the GNU, that it is now captured by Zanu PF. If you look at the 2023 elections, there can be no doubt that Triple C participated in those elections, knowing fully well that the process is flawed, knowing fully well that participating will only give Zanu PF legitimacy. They participated nonetheless out of greed, because they also knew that Zanu PF was giving away a few gravy train seats to those who participated. So, in other words, Triple C was no more than Zanu PF Team B. They were playing for Team A to win, and they were playing to give Team A legitimacy. And that's what they did. We have got to be smart enough to realize that the only way to break this vicious cycle of rigged elections, giving Zanu PF political legitimacy, and then we are told we are going to win the next elections, and the same thing happens over again, is we should be firm on the issue of reforms and making sure that elections are free, fair, and credible. And to go back to the elections in South Africa, I believe that if come the 29th of May, the South African people themselves give ANC a bloody nose, send a clear message that ANC must be democratically accountable to the people, or they are not going to get the people's vote. They should not assume that just because they were the spearheaded the fight for independence, they have got the right, the divine right to rule that country. In the same way that Zanu PF has destroyed the country's democratic institutions to impose itself as the only party in the country. We have a de facto one-party state in Zimbabwe. There's no denying it. And they've maintained that position by capturing all the institutions. Unfortunately, including the opposition. And we, the people, have been very slow to realize that the opposition is no more than just Zanu PF Team B. But if the South Africans give ANC a bloody nose, I believe South Africa's ANC government, even if they go back into power as a weakened party or as a coalition, they will stop propping up Zanu PF. That would be the beginning of the end of Zanu PF. Because without South Africa, ANC propping them up, I believe last year, SADC was in a position to say Zanu PF rigged the elections and denied them political legitimacy. They escaped, but only because ANC propped them up. Indeed, ANC Congress in 2022 came up with a resolution that they will not allow regime change in Zimbabwe. Because as far as they were concerned, regime change was only being encouraged by the West by imposing sanctions. Interestingly enough, SADC election observers and the AU election observers who observed those elections never mentioned sanctions. What they saw was an electoral process that was clearly flawed, that could not possibly represent the democratic will of the people. And they condemned it. And that is what as it should have been. Sanctions or no sanctions, there is no excuse for denying people their democratic right to a meaningful say in the governance of the country. Why should the ordinary Zimbabwean be denied their right to a free vote because the West has imposed sanctions on Zanu PF? What is the ordinary person to do with it? That has been a flaw with ANC. ANC wanted to make sure there's no change in Zimbabwe for their own selfish reasons. I hope that come the 29th of May, the people of South Africa will really send a clear message that they want ANC government that is accountable to the people. And that will be very beneficial to the people of Zimbabwe themselves. Thank you very much for listening. Those who were able to join us today. We'll have another discussion at 7 o'clock UK time, 8 o'clock Zimbabwe time as usual. I hope you'll be able to join us. Thank you and have a good day.